There is a profound, almost suffocating silence that descends upon the shores of Lake Michigan in the dead of winter. When the temperature plummets and the moisture from the unfrozen waters collides with the freezing air, a thick, disorienting fog rolls across the ice. It is not just a weather phenomenon, it is a curtain. It swallows sound, erases the horizon, and turns the landscape into a blank, infinite white canvas. To stand in that fog is to feel entirely detached from the earth, as if you have stepped out of reality and into a void. It was into this exact void, in February of 1978, that 23-year-old Steven Kubacki vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that would stretch the limits of human logic. Steven was a student at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, a young man who found solace in the raw, unforgiving beauty of nature. On February 20, he packed his cross-country skis and told his friends he was heading to the Saugatuck Dunes area, a rugged stretch of shoreline where the wind howls through the frozen trees. He was seeking a brief escape, a moment of solitude before the looming pressures of graduation and adulthood closed in around him. But as he pushed off into the snow, gliding toward the frozen expanse of the lake, the weather began to shift. The sky bruised into a dull gray, and that heavy, characteristic fog began to bleed out from the tree line. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment, the comforting crunch of snow beneath your skis, slowly fading as the white mist thickens, wrapping around you like a damp shroud. You look back and the trees are gone. You look forward and the lake is invisible. There is only the biting cold, the sound of your own erratic breathing, and an overwhelming primal sense of isolation. When Steven failed to return the next day, the quiet concern of his friends rapidly escalated into a full-scale panic. By February 21, local authorities had mobilized a massive search effort, converging on the desolate dunes. What they found only deepened the chill in the air. Sitting upright in the snow, neatly planted as if waiting for their owner's imminent return, were Steven's skis and poles. Nearby, his backpack lay abandoned. The physical search immediately yielded a chilling piece of evidence, a single set of footprints leading away from the gear, heading straight out onto the frozen, treacherous surface of Lake Michigan. The searchers followed the tracks, their breath pluming in the frigid air, until the footprints reached the edge of the solid ice. And then, they simply stopped.
There were no footprints leading back. There were no scuff marks, no disturbed snow, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Steven had taken a final step into the fog and dissolved into the atmosphere. Hoping to catch a scent, police brought in highly trained tracking dogs, but the animals exhibited entirely bizarre behavior. The moment they entered the thickest patches of the fog, the dogs began to whine, walking in dizzying circles, their normally razor-sharp senses entirely scrambled. Above them, the search and rescue helicopters fared no better. Pilots reported severe spatial disorientation when flying low over the mist, their instruments seemingly mocked by the heavy, unnatural density of the fog, forcing them to pull back or risk crashing into the unseen ice. Faced with a physical trail that had impossibly evaporated, the investigation was forced to pivot toward rational theories. The most immediate assumption was a tragic accident. Perhaps Steven, blinded by the whiteout, had unknowingly wandered onto a fragile shelf of ice. He could have slipped into a deep crevice or plunged through a hidden sinkhole into the freezing black waters below, the ice quickly freezing over his entry point, hiding his body forever. Yet seasoned searchers noted that the ice where his tracks ended was incredibly thick, showing no structural fractures or weak points. This lack of physical disturbance gave rise to a second, more psychological theory, a self-staged disappearance. Steven was a young man standing at the precipice of a demanding future, learning German, facing the crushing societal expectations of carving out a career and a life. Did the overwhelming pressure fracture his resolve? Investigators wondered if he had used the isolating fog as a theatrical cover, deliberately leaving his gear as a decoy to walk away, change his name, and start anew, shedding the heavy skin of his former life. But as days bled into weeks and weeks into months, a quiet unease began to settle over the locals. The Lake Michigan Triangle is a region steeped in maritime lore, infamous for vanishing ships and unexplained aerial anomalies. When rational logic fails, the human mind inevitably reaches for the uncanny. Whispers began to circulate that the fog was not merely condensed moisture, but a literal spatial anomaly, a tear in the fabric of the environment, a time slip. To those entertaining this theory, the fog acted as an unseen threshold. Steven didn't fall through the ice, he stepped out of our dimensional reality. Others theorized something far more sinister, a hidden predator. They imagined a human perpetrator, or perhaps an entity entirely familiar with the blinding terrain, hunting perfectly within the whiteout, striking silently and carrying him away without leaving a single trace in the snow. Despite the theories, the search eventually scaled back, and the world moved on. The ice melted, the seasons turned, and Steven Kubacki was officially woven into the tragic folklore of the lake. Until May 5, 1979. 15 months after he vanished into the freezing mist of Michigan, the sun was shining brightly on a grassy field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 700 miles away. A man lay in the dirt, the breeze rustling his hair. He opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh sunlight, his mind shrouded in a deep, disorienting fog of its own. He looked down at his body. He was wearing the exact same clothes he had on when he went skiing. To his absolute bewilderment, he felt no different. He looked no older. As he sat up, brushing the dirt from his jacket, he believed with absolute certainty that it was still February 1978. For Steven Kubacki, 15 months had simply never happened.
The transition from the freezing, whiteout conditions of the Lake Michigan shoreline to the mild, sun-drenched hills of Massachusetts was not a gradual journey for Steven Kubacki. It was a violent, instantaneous displacement of the soul. Imagine the psychological vertigo of such an awakening. One moment you were squinting against a blinding blizzard, the scent of ice and pine needles sharp in your nostrils, the weight of skis on your feet, and the cold biting at your skin. In the very next heartbeat, the air is warm, the grass is soft, and the sound of distant traffic replaces the howling wind. He stood up in that Pittsfield field, his heart hammering against his ribs, looking at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. He checked the newspaper a passerby was holding, expecting to see a date in late February. Instead, the bold print screamed May 5, 1979. 15 months had been excised from his life, neatly carved out by an invisible blade, leaving behind a scar of total amnesia. As he walked toward a nearby house to ask for help, the reality of his situation began to settle like lead in his stomach. He wasn't just lost, he was a ghost who had decided to rejoin the living. When he finally reached his family, the phone call was a chilling collision of the impossible and the mundane. His father, who had likely spent the last year grieving a son he thought was at the bottom of a frozen lake, heard a voice that should have been silent forever. Steven's first words weren't a plea for help or an explanation of a kidnapping. They were the words of a man who had simply stepped out for a pack of cigarettes and returned a year later. He was healthy, he was coherent, and most disturbingly, he was wearing the same jacket, the same pants, and the same shirt he had disappeared in. Despite 15 months of supposed travel across 700 miles, his clothes were not the rags of a vagabond. They were remarkably well preserved, as if he had been kept in a vacuum, shielded from the passage of time and the wear of the elements. This is where the investigative layers begin to peel back, revealing a core of pure, concentrated mystery. When medical professionals and psychologists finally sat Steven down, they were looking for a breakdown, a trauma, or a hidden history of mental illness. They leaned heavily into the theory of a dissociative fugue. In the world of psychology, a fugue state is a rare and fascinating phenomenon where the mind, overwhelmed by stress or an identity crisis, simply reboots. The individual forgets who they are, wanders far from home, and adopts a new persona, often living a completely different life until something snaps them back into their original consciousness. From a scientific perspective, this was the most comfortable explanation. It suggested that Steven had lived a quiet, anonymous life somewhere in the Northeast for 15 months, perhaps working odd jobs under a different name, until the spring air of 1979 triggered his dormant memories. Yet this rational theory began to crumble under the weight of physical evidence. If Steven had been living a second life, how had he managed to leave no trail? In 15 months, a man must eat, he must sleep, he must interact with the world, but no one, not a single soul, could place Steven Kubacki in any town, shelter, or workplace between Michigan and Massachusetts during that gap. Furthermore, his physical condition was an anomaly. He hadn't lost significant weight, his hair hadn't grown to the length one would expect after a year without a haircut, and his skin didn't show the weathering of a man who had spent 15 months on the road. It was as if his biological clock had paused the moment he stepped into that Michigan fog and only resumed its ticking when he opened his eyes in Pittsfield.
This leads us back to the layer of the uncanny. The theory that the fog was a threshold, a time slip, or a temporal rift. In this perspective, Steven didn't wander across the country. He was simply transported through a fold in space-time. To the observer in our world, 15 months passed. To Steven, it was the length of a single step. This theory, while dismissed by the rigid structures of traditional science, resonates with the ancient folklore of the Great Lakes, where thin places are said to exist, spots where the veil between what we know and what we cannot conceive is dangerously frayed. If the fog was a spatial portal, it explains why the dogs lost their scent, why the helicopters became disoriented, and why Steven felt no passage of time. He hadn't been hiding, he had been elsewhere. But there is a final, perhaps even more haunting layer to consider: the ego escape. As a student of philosophy and a seeker of solitude, was Steven perhaps more complicit in his disappearance than he realized? Perhaps it wasn't a physical portal, but a profound psychological choice. We all have moments where the weight of our identity, our name, our debts, our expectations, our very history, becomes a cage. Most of us just daydream about leaving. Steven, perhaps through some rare combination of environmental isolation and internal pressure, actually did it. He walked into the fog not to die, but to cease existing as Steven Kubacki. The fog wasn't just a weather event, it was a mirror. It reflected his desire to be nothing and no one. His brain didn't just break, it performed a perfect, clean deletion of his reality to save him from a life he could no longer carry. When he returned, Steven Kubacki chose a path that frustrated investigators and enthusiasts alike: silence. He refused most interviews, declined to profit from his story, and eventually went on to lead a quiet, successful life, even earning an advanced degree. He never offered a sensationalist explanation, nor did he claim to have been abducted by beings from another world. He simply said he didn't remember, and then he closed the door on the mystery. This silence is the most telling part of the story. It suggests a man who had looked into the void and decided that what he saw there didn't belong to the rest of us.
Whether it was a medical miracle of the mind or a genuine breach in the laws of physics, the case of the man in the fog remains one of the most compelling enigmas in American history. It challenges our comfortable assumption that time is a linear, unbreakable chain, and that the self is a permanent, stable construct. It reminds us that there are still places in this world, and within the human psyche, where the fog never truly lifts, leaving us to wander the dunes, searching for footprints that simply stop, leading into a white silence that refuses to give up its secrets. In the end, Steven Kubacki didn't just disappear from a lake, he disappeared from the very concept of knowing, leaving us only with the chilling realization that at any moment, any one of us could step into a mist and emerge into a world that has moved on without us.